The white roses were still fresh when I found the letter. My wedding dress hung pristine on the bedroom door, untouched, as if mocking the dreams I'd carried for 2 years. The morning light filtered through our apartment windows in Riverside, Oregon, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors Tyler and I had picked out together. Everything was exactly as we'd left it the night before, except for one crucial detail. My fiancé was gone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The suicide note lay folded on his pillow, my name written in his careful handwriting across cream-colored paper. But as I read those devastating words about how he couldn't go through with the wedding, how the pressure had become too much, how he loved me but couldn't be the man I deserved, something felt fundamentally wrong. Tyler Hamilton, the man who planned our entire future down to the color of our kitchen tiles, the man who never left without telling me where he was going, had supposedly walked away from everything without a trace. That's when I noticed his wedding ring sitting on the nightstand, not thrown carelessly, but placed with deliberate precision next to a photograph of us from last Christmas. Tyler was methodical about everything, but he was also fighting for his life in ways I was only beginning to understand. What looked like surrender was actually the final piece of evidence I needed to expose the truth about the Hamilton family. The Hamilton Development Company offices stood empty that Saturday morning, their glass facade reflecting the early autumn sky like a mirror of my own confusion. I clutched Tyler's note in my trembling hands, reading it for the dozenth time since discovering it 3 hours earlier. The wedding was supposed to begin at 4 that afternoon at Willowbrook Estate, where 200 guests would gather to witness what they believed would be the social event of the season in Riverside. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from Rachel Torres, my maid of honor, asking about final preparations. The florists had called twice about delivery timing. Caroline Stevens, our wedding planner, had left 4 increasingly frantic voicemails about coordinating with the caterers. The world was moving forward with our wedding while the groom had simply vanished into the Pacific Northwest morning. But something nagged at me beyond the obvious devastation. Tyler's handwriting in the note was perfect, too perfect. I'd watched him write thousands of documents during our 3 years together, seen his penmanship deteriorate when he was stressed or rushed. This note looked like it had been copied from a draft, each letter formed with unnatural care. The paper itself felt wrong too, expensive and unfamiliar. Tyler preferred simple notebook paper for personal messages, not this formal stationery that reminded me of his mother's correspondence. I drove to Willowbrook Estate despite everything, unable to process the magnitude of canceling a wedding just hours before the ceremony. The venue coordinator, a kindly woman named Mrs. Patterson, met me at the entrance with obvious concern etched across her face. She'd been expecting both Tyler and me for the final walkthrough, a tradition we'd planned together months ago. "Mrs. Brooks, we haven't seen Mr. Hamilton this morning," she said gently, her eyes taking in my disheveled appearance and the crumpled paper in my hands. "Is everything all right?" I showed her the note, watching her face change as she read Tyler's supposed final words. But Mrs. Patterson had been coordinating weddings for 25 years, and her expression shifted from sympathy to confusion as she studied the handwriting. "This doesn't look like the signature on his contract," she said quietly, glancing around to ensure we weren't overheard. "Mr. Hamilton signed our agreement just last week when he increased the guest count. The writing was much more relaxed." Her observation struck me like lightning. Tyler had indeed added more guests recently, over my mild objections about the expense. He'd insisted that certain family business associates needed to be included, people whose names I didn't recognize, but who apparently held significant influence in his mother's social circles. At the time, I'd attributed his urgency to pre-wedding stress and family pressure. The estate's gardens spread before us in perfect autumn splendor, exactly as Tyler and I had envisioned during our first visit here 18 months ago. He'd been so animated that day, describing where we'd stand for the ceremony, how the sunset would illuminate the mountains behind us during our first dance. The Tyler who'd planned every detail of this celebration wouldn't have walked away without explanation. The Tyler who'd spent weeks perfecting his vows, reading them to me in fragments when he thought I wasn't paying attention, wouldn't have left a cold, formal note as his final communication. My phone rang, interrupting my spiraling thoughts. Victoria Hamilton's name appeared on the screen, and I answered with a mixture of hope and dread. Tyler's mother had been notably absent from most of our wedding preparations, delegating details to Carolyn Stevens while maintaining an aloof interest in the proceedings. Her involvement had always felt more dutiful than enthusiastic, as if she were performing an obligation rather than celebrating her son's happiness. "Natalie, darling," Victoria's refined voice carried its usual controlled warmth. "I've been trying to reach Tyler all morning. Has he gotten cold feet about the ceremony? You know how sensitive he can be about public attention?" The casual dismissal in her tone caught me off guard. Victoria spoke as if Tyler's disappearance was merely a minor inconvenience, a scheduling conflict, rather than a potential tragedy. Her lack of concern seemed particularly odd given that Tyler had been exhibiting increasing anxiety over the past several months, anxiety that his family had consistently attributed to normal pre-wedding jitters. "He left a note," I managed to say, my voice catching. "Victoria, I think something might be seriously wrong." "A note?" Her tone sharpened with what sounded more like irritation than worry. "What kind of note?" I read her Tyler's message word for word, listening to the silence that followed. When Victoria finally responded, her voice had shifted into what I recognized as her crisis management mode, the same controlled authority she used when handling problems with the family business. "This is obviously a temporary breakdown from stress," she said decisively. "Tyler has always been fragile when it comes to major life changes. The best thing we can do is give him space to work through this episode. I'll have Dr. Reed make some calls to locate him." Dr. Marcus Reed was Tyler's longtime therapist, a family friend who'd been treating him for anxiety since his college years. Victoria had recommended Dr. Reed when Tyler first started experiencing what she called nervous episodes during our engagement. The sessions had been helpful initially, or so Tyler claimed, though I'd noticed his anxiety seemed to increase rather than decrease over the months of treatment. Something about Victoria's immediate solution bothered me. Most mothers would be frantically calling hospitals or organizing search parties if their son vanished on his wedding day with a suicide note. Victoria's response was measured, almost as if she'd been expecting this development. Her suggestion to give Tyler space felt particularly strange given that he'd left what appeared to be a goodbye letter expressing his intention to harm himself. I ended the call feeling more unsettled than comforted. The rational part of my mind understood that families cope with crisis differently, and Victoria had always been a private person who handled problems with methodical precision. But my instincts as a financial analyst, trained to spot discrepancies and hidden patterns, were triggering alarms I couldn't ignore. Back at our apartment, I began examining Tyler's behavior over the past few months, with the same scrutiny I applied to suspicious financial statements at Sterling & Associates. The signs had been there, subtle but consistent, like doctored numbers in an audit that only revealed their deception under careful analysis. Tyler's appetite had decreased steadily since summer. He'd been having trouble sleeping, often lying awake staring at the ceiling while claiming he was just excited about the wedding. His concentration at work had suffered, according to his assistant, who'd mentioned that he seemed distracted during important client meetings. Most tellingly, Tyler had become increasingly secretive about his family therapy sessions with Dr. Reed. Initially, he'd shared insights from their conversations, talking about managing anxiety and developing coping strategies for work stress. But recently he'd grown evasive when I asked about the appointments, saying only that they were working through some complicated family dynamics related to the wedding. I called Rachel Torres, needing someone rational to help me process the morning's events. Rachel had known Tyler almost as long as I had, having introduced us at a charity fundraiser where she'd been volunteering, and he'd been representing the Hamilton Development Company's community outreach efforts. Her perspective on his character and behavior patterns could help me determine whether his disappearance was truly voluntary. "Nat, this doesn't make sense," Rachel said after I'd explained the situation. "Tyler spent 20 minutes last week showing me pictures of your honeymoon suite in Hawaii, going on about the ocean view he'd requested specifically for your morning coffee routine. Men don't plan romantic details like that if they're planning to bolt. Rachel's observation aligned with my own confused assessment of Tyler's recent behavior. He'd been meticulously organizing aspects of our post-wedding life, even as his anxiety had intensified. He'd renewed our apartment lease for another year, purchased a more expensive life insurance policy, and had even been researching neighborhoods for our eventual house purchase. These weren't the actions of someone preparing to abandon their life. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains, marking the time when our wedding ceremony should have been starting. Instead of walking down the aisle at Willowbrook Estate, I was sitting in our empty apartment trying to decode whether my fiancé had suffered a mental health crisis or whether something more sinister had occurred. The wedding dress hanging on our bedroom door seemed to watch me with accusation, a white silk reminder of dreams that had evaporated in a single morning. My phone buzzed with a text from Caroline Stevens asking for direction about the guests beginning to arrive at the venue. 200 people were gathering to celebrate a union that had imploded before it could begin. I needed to make decisions about cancellation, about notifications, about the practical nightmare of undoing months of careful planning.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
But beneath the immediate crisis management needs, a deeper certainty was crystallizing in my mind. Tyler Hamilton had not written that suicide note. Someone else had composed those words, copied his handwriting with careful precision, and placed the letter where I would find it. The question that terrified me most wasn't whether Tyler was alive, but who had the power and motivation to make him disappear on what should have been the happiest day of our lives. I opened my laptop and began creating a document to track every discrepancy I could identify about Tyler's disappearance. My training at Sterling & Associates had taught me that financial fraud usually left trails, patterns of deception that revealed themselves through methodical analysis. If someone had orchestrated Tyler's vanishing, they would have made mistakes, left evidence, created inconsistencies that careful investigation could expose. The wedding dress continued its silent vigil as I worked, transforming from a symbol of celebration into a reminder of the mystery I needed to solve. Somewhere in Riverside, Tyler Hamilton was either fighting for his life or being held against his will. And I was going to find him before whoever had taken him realized that his disappearance had left behind the one person capable of unraveling their carefully constructed deception. The afternoon shadows lengthened across our apartment floor as I began the investigation that would either bring Tyler home or expose the truth about why someone wanted him gone. The wedding was over before it began, but the real story was just starting to unfold. Part 2. The hidden truth emerges. 3 weeks before our wedding day, Tyler had started keeping a journal. I discovered it now, hidden beneath a stack of financial documents in his home office, written in the same careful handwriting that had composed his supposed suicide note. The entries revealed a man trapped in circumstances far more complex than simple pre-wedding anxiety. The first entry was dated exactly 21 days before his disappearance. Tyler wrote about feeling watched, about conversations with his mother that left him disoriented and confused. He described sessions with Dr. Reed that focused less on anxiety management and more on what the therapist called family loyalty exercises. These exercises apparently involved guided meditation, where Tyler was encouraged to visualize scenarios where he might need to sacrifice his personal desires for the greater good of the Hamilton legacy. Reading Tyler's private thoughts, I began to understand the systematic erosion of his autonomy that had been occurring right under my nose. His journal entries revealed a pattern of manipulation so subtle that even Tyler himself had initially dismissed it as loving family concern. Victoria had been orchestrating a campaign to convince Tyler that marriage to me represented a threat to everything the Hamilton family had built over 3 generations. The Hamilton Development Company wasn't just a real estate business. According to Tyler's increasingly frantic journal entries, the company served as a front for a complex money laundering operation that funneled drug profits through legitimate construction projects across the Pacific Northwest. Tyler had discovered this truth accidentally when reviewing contracts for a new shopping center development, noticing payment schedules that made no economic sense and subcontractors whose credentials couldn't be verified. Tyler's journal revealed that he'd confronted his mother about the suspicious financial patterns 3 months before our wedding. Victoria's response had been swift and devastating. She'd convinced him that his discovery put not only the family business at risk, but also endangered my safety and the safety of anyone else who might accidentally stumble upon their operation. Dr. Reed had reinforced these fears during their therapy sessions, using psychological techniques to amplify Tyler's anxiety about protecting me from consequences he couldn't fully understand. The entries became increasingly desperate as our wedding date approached. Tyler wrote about feeling like he was losing his mind, unable to distinguish between legitimate concerns and manufactured fears. Victoria had begun suggesting that the stress of the wedding was affecting his judgment, that his accusations about the business were symptoms of a mental breakdown rather than valid observations. Dr. Reed supported this narrative, adjusting Tyler's medication and introducing new therapeutic approaches that left Tyler feeling disconnected from his own thoughts and perceptions. 4 days before the wedding, Tyler had made a decision that would ultimately save both our lives. He'd begun secretly documenting the evidence he'd discovered, photographing financial records and recording conversations with family members. His journal revealed that he'd hidden this evidence in multiple locations around Riverside, creating what he called an insurance policy in case something happened to him. The wedding was supposed to be his escape plan. After our honeymoon, he intended to take his evidence to federal authorities and expose the Hamilton family's criminal enterprise. But Tyler had underestimated his family's willingness to eliminate threats to their operation. His journal's final entry, written the night before our wedding, expressed growing fear that his mother and Dr. Reed were planning something drastic to prevent him from following through with his plans. He'd noticed changes in his medication that left him feeling sedated and compliant. He'd overheard phone conversations between Victoria and unknown associates discussing, quote, permanent solutions to their Tyler problem. The most chilling revelation in Tyler's journal was his description of a conversation with Dr. Reed about something called therapeutic intervention. The therapist had explained that sometimes, when patients posed risks to themselves and others through delusional thinking, more intensive treatment became necessary. This treatment might require temporary separation from triggering environments and relationships. Tyler had interpreted this as a threat of involuntary commitment, but reading his words now, I realized the implications were far more sinister. I photographed every page of Tyler's journal, uploading the images to multiple cloud storage accounts to ensure the evidence couldn't be destroyed. Then I began following the trail of clues Tyler had left, starting with a safety deposit box key he'd hidden inside an old coffee can in our kitchen. The key was attached to a note written in Tyler's handwriting, but this note was genuine, hastily scrawled and authentic in a way his supposed suicide letter had never been. Natalie, the real note read, if you're reading this, something has happened to me. Box 247 at Riverside First National contains everything you need to understand why. Trust no one in my family except possibly Grace. Dr. Reed is not what he seems. I love you more than my own life, which is why I have to protect you from what I've discovered. Find Detective Lisa Park at Riverside PD. She's the only cop in this town who isn't on my mother's payroll. The safety deposit box contained a treasure trove of evidence that painted a picture of corruption extending far beyond the Hamilton family business. Tyler had documented payoffs to city council members, bribes to construction inspectors, and most damaging of all, evidence of a systematic money laundering operation that had been funneling millions of dollars through Riverside's development projects for over a decade. Bank records showed regular transfers from shell companies registered in Nevada and Delaware, all ultimately controlled by the Hamilton Development Company. These funds were being used to purchase properties at inflated prices, renovate them using subcontractors who existed only on paper, then sell them at losses that were actually profits once the laundered money was factored into the equation. The operation was sophisticated, involving multiple layers of legitimate-seeming transactions that would be nearly impossible to trace without inside knowledge. But the most devastating evidence Tyler had collected was a series of recorded conversations with Dr. Reed that revealed the therapist's true role in the Hamilton family operation. Dr. Reed wasn't just providing psychological manipulation services to keep Tyler compliant. He was running what amounted to a private psychiatric facility, where inconvenient family members and business associates could be held indefinitely, under the guise of voluntary mental health treatment. The recordings revealed that Tyler wasn't Dr. Reed's first victim. Grace Hamilton, Tyler's sister, had been subjected to similar treatment 5 years earlier, when she'd threatened to expose irregularities in the family foundation's charitable giving. She'd spent 6 months in Dr. Reed's facility, emerging with no memory of her previous concerns and a new dedication to family loyalty. 2 business partners who'd asked uncomfortable questions about project financing had also disappeared into Dr. Reed's care, eventually reappearing as different people who showed no interest in pursuing their previous investigations. Tyler's voice on the recordings was increasingly strained as he described his growing understanding of his family's operation. He'd realized that his supposed anxiety disorder had been artificially induced through medication and psychological manipulation, designed to make him dependent on Dr. Reed's treatment and more susceptible to family influence. The therapist had been gradually increasing Tyler's medication dosages, preparing him for the kind of intensive intervention that had transformed Grace and the others. The final recording in Tyler's collection was made 3 days before our wedding, during what Tyler believed would be his last session with Dr. Reed. The therapist's voice was calm and clinical, as he explained that Tyler's obsession with imaginary criminal activity was escalating to dangerous levels. The upcoming wedding was clearly triggering deeper psychological instabilities that required immediate attention. Dr. Reed recommended postponing the marriage indefinitely, while Tyler received treatment at a specialized facility where he could be properly monitored and medicated. Tyler's response on the recording was heartbreaking. His voice shook as he pleaded with Dr. Reed to understand that he wasn't delusional, that the evidence he'd discovered was real and documented. But the therapist simply noted Tyler's persistent paranoid ideation and recommended that Victoria begin making arrangements for involuntary commitment proceedings. The recording ended with Tyler promising to comply with whatever treatment Dr. Reed recommended, a promise he'd apparently made to buy himself time to execute his escape plan. I realized that Tyler's disappearance on our wedding day hadn't been voluntary suicide or a mental breakdown. He'd been taken, probably drugged, and transported to one of Dr. Reed's facilities, where he was being held under the pretense of psychiatric treatment. The suicide note had been forged to prevent anyone from looking for him, creating a narrative that would discourage investigation and allow his family to claim he'd died by his own hand after sufficient time had passed. But Tyler had anticipated this possibility, leaving me a trail of evidence that could expose not only his location, but the entire criminal operation that had made his disappearance necessary. His journal had included detailed descriptions of Dr. Reed's known facilities, including a private clinic hidden in the mountains outside Riverside that operated without state oversight or inspection. If Tyler was alive, that's where I would find him. The weight of Tyler's trust in me was overwhelming. He'd spent months preparing for this moment, anticipating that his family would eventually move against him, and positioning me as the only person capable of unraveling their deception. His faith in my analytical abilities and investigative instincts had led him to create an evidence package that could bring down one of the most sophisticated criminal operations in Oregon's history. I understood now why Victoria had been so controlled in her response to Tyler's disappearance. She'd been expecting it, had probably been planning it for weeks. Her suggestion to give Tyler space was designed to prevent anyone from looking for him too quickly, allowing Dr. Reed time to complete whatever psychological conditioning process would transform Tyler into another compliant family member with no memory of his previous concerns. The apartment felt different now, charged with the weight of Tyler's hidden investigation and the danger that knowledge represented. I was no longer just a abandoned bride trying to understand why her fiancé had left. I was the sole keeper of evidence that could expose a criminal enterprise worth millions of dollars, and the only person who knew that Tyler Hamilton was being held against his will by people who had perfected the art of making inconvenient problems disappear. Detective Lisa Park's name appeared multiple times in Tyler's notes, described as the one honest cop in a police department that had been systematically corrupted by Hamilton money over the years. Tyler had been preparing to approach her with his evidence, but his disappearance had moved up their timeline. Now I would have to make that contact, trusting Tyler's judgment about who could be trusted with information that would put my own life at risk. The evening shadows were lengthening across our apartment as I prepared to follow Tyler's trail deeper into the labyrinth of corruption that had swallowed him. The wedding dress still hung on our bedroom door, but it no longer seemed like a symbol of lost dreams. Instead, it had become a reminder of what I was fighting to reclaim, the future that Tyler and I had planned together, and that his family had tried to steal through manipulation and violence. Tomorrow I would begin the process of following Tyler's clues to their conclusion, starting with Detective Park and the evidence that could bring down the Hamilton empire. But tonight, I allowed myself to grieve for the man I'd fallen in love with, the man who'd sacrificed his safety to protect me from a truth too dangerous to ignore. Tyler Hamilton was still alive somewhere in the mountains outside Riverside, and I was going to bring him home. Part 3. The conspiracy unveiled. Detective Lisa Park had been expecting my call. When I reached her at Riverside Police Department the morning after discovering Tyler's journal, she listened to my story with the patience of someone who'd been waiting for this conversation for months. Her voice carried a weariness that spoke of investigations stalled by political pressure and evidence that had mysteriously disappeared from evidence lockers. Tyler Hamilton contacted me 6 weeks ago, Detective Park revealed during our first meeting at a coffee shop 40 minutes outside Riverside, far from the reach of Hamilton influence. He'd been trying to find someone in law enforcement who wasn't financially connected to his family. That's harder than you might think in this town. Detective Park was a 15-year veteran of the force who'd been systematically marginalized after refusing to look the other way on cases involving Hamilton Development Company. Her investigations into construction site accidents, environmental violations, and worker safety issues had repeatedly been reassigned to other detectives who found no evidence of wrongdoing. She'd been relegated to handling petty theft and minor drug possession cases, while more serious crimes involving Hamilton interests were handled by senior detectives who had all received generous donations to their retirement funds. Tyler's approach to Detective Park had been careful and methodical. He'd provided her with preliminary evidence of the money laundering operation, including bank records that showed impossible cash flows through legitimate construction projects. But Tyler had held back the most damaging evidence, waiting until after our wedding to provide Detective Park with everything she needed to build a federal case that couldn't be buried by local corruption. "Your fiancé was smart," Detective Park said, reviewing copies of Tyler's journal entries on her personal laptop. He understood that exposing this operation would require federal involvement. The Hamilton family has been cultivating relationships with local law enforcement for decades. Half the department has second jobs with Hamilton subsidiaries, and the other half receives regular donations to police charities that Victoria Hamilton chairs. The scope of the Hamilton family's influence extended far beyond what Tyler had documented in his private investigation. Detective Park had been tracking their operations for years, watching as they systematically corrupted every institution that might pose a threat to their criminal enterprise. City council members received consulting contracts with Hamilton Development Company. County commissioners found their children awarded scholarships from the Hamilton Foundation. Federal investigators who showed too much interest in Pacific Northwest money laundering were transferred to other regions after their supervisors received calls from influential politicians who owed their elections to Hamilton campaign contributions. Dr. Marcus Reed's role in the operation was particularly insidious. The therapist didn't just provide psychological services to the Hamilton family. He operated what Detective Park described as a network of unofficial detention facilities, disguised as private psychiatric hospitals. These facilities held people who posed threats to the Hamilton operation under the pretense of voluntary mental health treatment, using medication and psychological manipulation to eliminate their ability or desire to pursue their previous concerns. "We've had 7 missing persons cases over the past 5 years that all connect to the Hamilton family," Detective Park explained, showing me photographs and case files she'd assembled without official approval. Business partners who asked uncomfortable questions, employees who discovered irregularities, even family members who threatened to expose the operation. All of them eventually turned up at Dr. Reed's facilities, and all of them emerged as different people with no memory of their previous problems with the Hamiltons. The missing persons files painted a disturbing picture of systematic elimination of threats through what Dr. Reed called therapeutic intervention. The process apparently involved intensive medication, isolation from outside contacts, and psychological conditioning techniques that could alter personality and memory. Victims emerged from treatment as grateful patients who credited Dr. Reed with saving them from their own delusional thinking about the Hamilton family. Grace Hamilton's file was particularly heartbreaking. Tyler's sister had discovered discrepancies in the Hamilton Foundation's charitable giving 5 years earlier, noticing that donations intended for homeless shelters and drug treatment programs were being diverted to shell organizations controlled by the family. Grace had confronted Victoria about the missing funds, threatening to expose the foundation's activities to state charity oversight agencies. Within 2 weeks, Grace had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder and admitted to Dr. Reed's Mountain facility for intensive treatment. She'd emerged 6 months later with no memory of her concerns about the foundation and a new dedication to family loyalty that had persisted ever since. The vibrant, independent woman Tyler remembered from their childhood had been replaced by someone who seemed hollowed out, going through the motions of normal life while showing no spark of her former personality. Dr. Reed is running a sophisticated brainwashing operation, Detective Park said bluntly. The techniques he uses are based on research from intelligence agencies, adapted for civilian application. He can essentially erase inconvenient memories and replace them with artificial loyalties. It's the perfect solution for a criminal family that needs to eliminate threats without creating bodies that might trigger investigations. The Mountain facility where Detective Park believed Tyler was being held operated under multiple layers of legal protection. It was licensed as a private psychiatric hospital specializing in treatment-resistant depression and anxiety disorders. Patients were typically admitted on voluntary commitments that Dr. Reed obtained through psychological manipulation, making them technically legal even when the underlying circumstances were coercive. The facility's remote location made it nearly impossible to monitor. Situated in the Cascade Mountains, 60 miles from Riverside, it occupied a former logging camp that had been converted into what appeared to be a luxury retreat center. Patients' communications with the outside world were restricted during their treatment, supposedly to prevent triggering stimuli that might interfere with their recovery. Family members were encouraged to maintain distance while their loved ones received intensive care. Victoria Hamilton served on the facility's board of directors, providing both financial support and a pipeline of patients who required Dr. Reed's specialized services. The arrangement allowed the Hamilton family to eliminate threats while maintaining plausible deniability about their involvement. If anyone questioned the disappearance of troublesome individuals, they could point to medical records showing voluntary admission for psychiatric treatment. Detective Park had been trying to build a case against the facility for years, but her efforts had been consistently frustrated by the same corruption that protected other Hamilton interests. Judges who might issue search warrants had received campaign contributions from Hamilton-funded political action committees. State agencies that should oversee psychiatric facilities were staffed by former Hamilton employees or consultants. "I've been waiting for someone like Tyler," Detective Park admitted. "Someone with inside access to the evidence we need, and the courage to come forward despite the personal cost. When he disappeared on your wedding day, I knew we were running out of time. If we don't act soon, Tyler will become another success story for Dr. Reed's treatment program." The urgency in Detective Park's voice reflected her understanding of how Dr. Reed's conditioning process worked. The first few weeks of treatment involved intensive medication designed to make patients malleable and suggestible. After that came the psychological restructuring, where inconvenient memories were suppressed and new loyalties were installed through repetition and reinforcement. Patients who underwent the complete process emerged as different people, grateful for their treatment and unable to remember why they'd ever opposed the Hamilton family. Detective Park had developed a plan to infiltrate Dr. Reed's facility and gather evidence that could support federal intervention. The plan required someone with a plausible reason to visit the facility, someone who wouldn't trigger suspicions from staff who'd been trained to screen out potential investigators. Tyler's disappearance had created the perfect opportunity. Dr. Reed expects family members to be concerned about Tyler's treatment, Detective Park explained. Victoria has probably told him that you might try to contact Tyler or visit the facility. If you approach Dr. Reed as a worried fiancé seeking information about Tyler's condition, he'll be prepared for that conversation. It gives us an opening to get inside the facility and locate Tyler before the conditioning process is completed. The plan was dangerous, requiring me to enter a facility where people disappeared and emerged as different versions of themselves. But Detective Park had identified a narrow window of opportunity that might not come again. Federal investigators were finally beginning to pay attention to Pacific Northwest money laundering operations, prompted by pressure from agencies tracking international drug trafficking. If we could provide them with concrete evidence of the Hamilton family's activities, they might be willing to act despite local political resistance. Detective Park had been preparing for this moment for months, assembling a case file that documented the connections between the Hamilton family's various criminal enterprises. The money laundering operation was just one component of a larger network that included drug trafficking, human smuggling, and the systematic corruption of public officials across Oregon and Washington. The Hamiltons aren't just running a family business, Detective Park said, spreading photographs and documents across the coffee shop table. They're operating a criminal organization that has infiltrated government, law enforcement, and healthcare systems throughout the Pacific Northwest. Tyler's evidence is the key that can unlock federal intervention, but only if we can get him out of Dr. Reed's facility while he still remembers what he discovered. The weight of responsibility felt crushing. Tyler's life depended on my ability to infiltrate a sophisticated criminal operation without being detected. But Detective Park's confidence in our plan was infectious, based on years of careful observation and preparation. She'd been waiting for this opportunity to strike back against the corruption that had frustrated her career and endangered her community. As we prepared to leave the coffee shop, Detective Park handed me a small device that looked like an ordinary pen. Audio recorder, she explained. Federal quality, undetectable by standard security sweeps. Whatever you can capture during your visit to Dr. Reed's facility will be crucial for building our case. But remember, your primary objective is locating Tyler and confirming his condition. We'll only get one chance at this. The drive back to Riverside felt like preparation for battle. In less than 24 hours, I would be walking into the heart of the Hamilton family's operation, surrounded by people who had perfected the art of making problems disappear. Tyler was counting on me to find him before Dr. Reed's conditioning process transformed him into another grateful patient, with no memory of the evidence that could bring down his family's criminal empire. The apartment felt different when I returned, charged with the knowledge of what Tyler had been trying to protect me from and what I now had to do to save him. The wedding dress hanging on our bedroom door had become a symbol of everything I was fighting to reclaim, the future that Victoria Hamilton and Dr. Reed had tried to steal through manipulation and psychological warfare. Part 4. The public exposure. The Cascade Mountain facility appeared from the mountain road like a mirage of respectability, its contemporary architecture and manicured landscaping designed to project an image of cutting-edge mental health care rather than the prison it actually was. Dr. Reed had agreed to meet with me after I'd called claiming desperate concern about Tyler's condition and my need to understand his treatment plan. The therapist's voice had been professionally sympathetic, exactly as Tyler had described in his recordings. I'd spent the previous evening memorizing every detail of Detective Park's plan, practicing my role as the concerned fiancé who'd been devastated by Tyler's apparent breakdown. The recording device disguised as a pen felt heavy in my jacket pocket, a reminder of the evidence I needed to gather and the danger I was walking into. Tyler had been held at this facility for 5 days now, long enough for Dr. Reed to begin the conditioning process, but hopefully not long enough to complete it. Dr. Reed met me in the facility's reception area, a space designed to look more like a luxury hotel lobby than a medical facility. His appearance was exactly as Tyler had described in his journal. Distinguished and reassuring with silver hair and kind eyes that projected professional competence. Only someone who'd read Tyler's evidence would recognize the predatory calculation behind Dr. Reed's therapeutic demeanor. "Ms. Brooks," Dr. Reed said, his voice carrying the controlled warmth he'd perfected over years of manipulating vulnerable patients. "I'm so sorry we're meeting under these circumstances. Tyler has spoken of you often during our sessions. He's receiving excellent care here, and I'm optimistic about his progress." The casual mention of Tyler's condition was delivered as if his commitment was routine rather than the result of elaborate criminal conspiracy. Dr. Reed guided me through corridors lined with expensive artwork and comfortable seating areas, maintaining the illusion that this was a voluntary treatment center rather than a detention facility. But I noticed details that betrayed the true nature of the operation: security cameras in every corner, doors that required keycards to open, windows that had been designed not to open at all. Tyler's case is particularly complex, Dr. Reed explained as we walked toward his office. The stress of your upcoming wedding apparently triggered a severe paranoid episode involving elaborate delusions about his family's business activities. These types of breaks from reality can be very convincing to the patient, which makes treatment challenging. Dr. Reed's description of Tyler's condition was textbook gaslighting, designed to undermine any credibility Tyler might have if he tried to communicate with me about his actual situation. The therapist was preemptively explaining away anything Tyler might say about the Hamilton family's criminal activities, framing his accusations as symptoms of mental illness rather than legitimate concerns backed by documented evidence. The office we entered was designed to project authority and trustworthiness, filled with medical diplomas, professional certifications, and photographs of Dr. Reed receiving awards from various psychiatric organizations. But Tyler's recordings had revealed that many of these credentials were purchased from diploma mills or obtained through organizations that Dr. Reed himself had funded through Hamilton money. "I'd like to see Tyler," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the fear coursing through my system. "I need to understand what happened to him, why he changed so suddenly." Dr. Reed's expression shifted slightly, a micro-expression of annoyance that he quickly covered with professional concern. "Tyler's treatment plan requires isolation from potentially triggering relationships during the initial stabilization phase," he explained. "Contact with family members or romantic partners can reinforce delusional thinking patterns. However, I can show you our treatment facility and explain the therapeutic approaches we're using." The tour Dr. Reed provided was clearly designed to impress visitors while concealing the facility's true purpose. We walked through common areas that looked like luxury resort lounges, past recreational facilities that could have belonged to an expensive spa, and by treatment rooms that resembled meditation studios rather than medical examination spaces. But I noticed that we never encountered any patients during our tour, and Dr. Reed steered us away from certain corridors without explanation. "Our approach combines the latest pharmaceutical interventions with intensive psychotherapy," Dr. Reed explained as we viewed a treatment room equipped with comfortable chairs and soft lighting. "Many of our patients arrive with complex paranoid delusions that require careful management. The initial phase of treatment involves medication adjustments to stabilize mood and reduce anxiety, followed by therapeutic work to help patients distinguish between reality and their delusional constructs." The clinical language drive Reed used couldn't disguise what he was actually describing: the systematic drugging and psychological manipulation of people who posed threats to the Hamilton family. His explanation of treatment methodology was essentially a confession to the crimes documented in Tyler's evidence, delivered with the confidence of someone who believed his victims had no recourse. "How long will Tyler need to remain here?" I asked, activating the recording device in my pocket with a subtle movement Dr. Reed couldn't observe. "Cases like Tyler's typically require 6 to 8 months of intensive treatment," Dr. Reed replied without hesitation. "Paranoid delusions involving family members can be particularly resistant to therapy. We often find that complete separation from the triggering environment is necessary for full recovery. 6 to 8 months would be more than enough time to complete the conditioning process that had transformed Grace Hamilton and the other victims Detective Park had identified." Dr. Reed was casually describing Tyler's psychological destruction as if it were a routine medical procedure, revealing the cold calculation behind his therapeutic facade. "I've brought some personal items that might help with Tyler's recovery," I said, producing a small bag containing photographs and mementos from our relationship. Perhaps seeing familiar objects might provide comfort during his treatment. Dr. Reed accepted the bag with apparent gratitude, but I noticed him examining each item carefully, as if checking for hidden recording devices or other surveillance equipment. His paranoia about potential investigation was palpable, despite his confident demeanor about Tyler's treatment. "We'll review these items with Tyler during his next therapy session," Dr. Reed said, setting the bag aside. "However, I should warn you that patients in Tyler's condition sometimes react negatively to reminders of relationships they've developed during their delusional periods. He may not recognize the significance of these objects, or he may become agitated by memories associated with his paranoid thinking. The implication was clear. Dr. Reed was preparing me for the possibility that Tyler might not remember our relationship, or might react to me as a stranger. The conditioning process apparently involved not just suppressing inconvenient memories, but restructuring personal relationships that might interfere with family loyalty. As our meeting continued, Reed became increasingly comfortable sharing details about Tyler's treatment, apparently confident that I posed no threat to his operation. He described medication adjustments designed to enhance Tyler's, quote, therapeutic compliance, psychological techniques intended to help Tyler recognize the unrealistic nature of his previous concerns, and family therapy sessions that would eventually help Tyler, quote, rebuild healthy relationships with his loved ones. Each euphemism Dr. Reed used was more chilling than the last, clinical language that disguised systematic psychological torture. The recording device in my pocket was capturing every word, building the evidence that Detective Park needed to convince federal investigators to intervene. But I was also gathering intelligence about Tyler's location and condition that would be crucial for any rescue attempt. Tyler is currently in our residential wing, Dr. Reed mentioned casually while describing the facility's various treatment areas. The mountain air and natural setting provide an ideal environment for psychological healing. Many of our patients find the isolation from urban distractions helpful for focusing on their recovery. The residential wing was apparently located in a separate building connected to the main facility by covered walkways. Dr. Reed's description suggested that patients were housed in individual rooms rather than shared accommodations, which would make locating Tyler more challenging but also reduce the risk of other patients being endangered during any rescue operation. Our conversation was interrupted by a staff member who needed Dr. Reed's immediate attention regarding a, quote, patient incident in the residential wing. The therapist excused himself apologetically, promising to return shortly to continue our discussion. His absence provided me with the opportunity I'd been hoping for, a chance to explore areas of the facility that hadn't been included in the official tour. The corridors Dr. Reed had avoided during our tour led toward what appeared to be the facility's actual treatment areas, far removed from the luxury amenities displayed for visitors. Here the architecture was more institutional, with reinforced doors, small windows, and security equipment that would be appropriate for a maximum security facility rather than a voluntary psychiatric hospital. I followed signs pointing toward the residential wing, moving as quickly as possible while trying to appear like a lost visitor rather than an infiltrator. The recording device continued capturing audio, documenting my observations of the facility's true layout and security measures. Detective Park would need this information to plan any law enforcement response. The residential wing was accessed through a security checkpoint that required keycard authorization, but the door had been left propped open by maintenance staff working in the corridor. I slipped through the opening and found myself in a hallway lined with numbered doors, each equipped with small observation windows and electronic locks. This was clearly where patients were held rather than housed, despite Dr. Reed's careful language about voluntary treatment. Room 247 contained the person I'd been searching for. Tyler lay on a narrow bed, his eyes open but unfocused, clearly under the influence of heavy sedation. He was thinner than when I'd last seen him, and his face had the vacant expression I'd observed in Grace Hamilton after her treatment. But he was alive, and there was still a possibility that the conditioning process hadn't progressed beyond the point of recovery. Tyler's recognition of me was delayed but genuine. His eyes focused slowly, and I saw a flicker of the man I'd fallen in love with, struggling against whatever medication they'd given him. He tried to speak, but his words were slurred and difficult to understand. The man who'd planned every detail of our wedding had been reduced to a drugged shadow of himself, but his essential personality seemed intact beneath the chemical fog. "Natalie," Tyler managed to whisper, his voice barely audible. Evidence hidden need to stop them before. His words trailed off as footsteps echoed in the corridor outside his room. Dr. Reed had discovered my unauthorized exploration of the facility, and his voice carried none of the professional warmth he'd projected during our meeting. Security staff were being summoned, and I realized that my infiltration of the facility had been discovered. But I'd accomplished what Detective Park needed: proof that Tyler was being held against his will, confirmation of his location, and recorded evidence of Dr. Reed's confession to the systematic psychological manipulation of patients who posed threats to the Hamilton family. The recording device had captured everything, from Dr. Reed's clinical descriptions of Tyler's treatment to my own observations of the facility's true nature. The drive down the mountain toward Riverside felt like an escape from enemy territory, my heart racing with the knowledge of what I'd discovered and the danger I'd narrowly avoided. Tyler was alive but in immediate peril, and the evidence I'd gathered would either save him or put both of us in greater danger if the Hamilton family realized the extent of what I now knew about their operation. Detective Park was waiting at our predetermined meeting location, her expression grim as she reviewed the audio recordings I'd captured at Dr. Reed's facility. The evidence was better than she'd dared hope, providing federal investigators with proof of systematic human rights violations and psychological torture that no amount of local political influence could suppress. "This is enough," Detective Park said after listening to Dr. Reed's recorded confessions. "Federal agents will move within hours. The Hamilton family's protection network won't be able to stop this level of evidence from reaching the right people. The next 12 hours would determine whether Tyler could be rescued before Dr. Reed's conditioning process transformed him into another grateful patient with no memory of the evidence that could expose his family's criminal empire." But for the first time since finding Tyler's fake suicide note, I felt hope that justice might actually be possible. Part 5. Justice and New Beginnings. Federal agents surrounded Dr. Reed's mountain facility at dawn, their coordinated assault designed to prevent the destruction of evidence and ensure the safety of patients who'd been held against their will. Detective Park had worked through the night with FBI investigators, using Tyler's evidence and my recordings to obtain warrants that local corruption couldn't obstruct. The sight of federal vehicles racing up the mountain road represented justice finally reaching people who'd believed themselves untouchable. Tyler's rescue from room 247 required immediate medical intervention to counteract the effects of drugs that had been administered without his informed consent. The medications Dr. Reed had been using weren't just sedatives. They were experimental compounds designed to enhance psychological conditioning, substances that would have caused permanent neurological damage if the treatment had continued much longer. Tyler's mumbled warnings about stopping them before had been his last coherent attempt to communicate the urgency of exposing his family's operation. The federal raid on Dr. Reed's facility uncovered evidence of systematic human rights violations that extended far beyond the Hamilton family's money laundering operation. Patient records revealed dozens of cases where people had been held for months or years under false pretenses, subjected to experimental psychological conditioning, and released as fundamentally different individuals with no memory of their previous concerns about various criminal enterprises. Grace Hamilton was found in room 156, 5 years after her supposed recovery from bipolar disorder. Her medical records showed continuous treatment with experimental drugs that had gradually erased her memories of discovering the Hamilton Foundation's fraudulent activities. The vibrant, independent woman Tyler remembered from their childhood was still there beneath the chemical fog, slowly emerging as federal medical teams worked to reverse the effects of Dr. Reed's conditioning protocols. Victoria Hamilton was arrested at her Riverside mansion while attempting to destroy financial records that detailed the money laundering operation Tyler had discovered. FBI agents had moved simultaneously against all components of the Hamilton criminal enterprise, preventing the systematic destruction of evidence that had protected the family for decades. The carefully constructed network of corruption crumbled within hours, as federal authorities bypassed local political protection through jurisdictional authority that couldn't be challenged. The scope of the Hamilton family's criminal activities shocked even experienced federal investigators. The money laundering operation Tyler had uncovered was just one component of a criminal empire that had infiltrated government institutions, healthcare systems, and law enforcement agencies throughout the Pacific Northwest. Bank records seized during the coordinated raids revealed transactions totaling hundreds of millions of dollars, representing one of the largest money laundering operations ever discovered in the region. Dr. Reed's confession came quickly once federal agents confronted him with recordings of his casual descriptions of patient treatment protocols. The therapist had been operating his psychological conditioning program for over a decade, serving not just the Hamilton family but other criminal organizations that needed inconvenient people eliminated, without creating bodies that might trigger investigations. His patient files contain detailed records of the conditioning techniques used, providing federal investigators with evidence of systematic torture disguised as medical treatment. Tyler's recovery from Dr. Reed's conditioning required months of specialized treatment, but federal medical experts were optimistic about his long-term prognosis. The drugs administered during his captivity had been designed to enhance psychological malleability rather than cause permanent damage, meaning that his memories and personality could be fully restored with appropriate medical intervention. The man who'd risked everything to expose his family's crimes was slowly returning, his courage and determination intact, despite the trauma he'd endured. The federal trials that followed revealed the full extent of corruption that had protected the Hamilton family's operations for decades. City council members who'd received consulting contracts, county commissioners whose children had benefited from Hamilton Foundation scholarships, and police officials who'd accepted donations to departmental charities all found themselves facing federal corruption charges. The systematic nature of the bribery network demonstrated how criminal enterprises could capture entire communities through seemingly legitimate financial relationships. Detective Park was vindicated after years of frustrated investigations, her persistence in documenting Hamilton family activities providing federal prosecutors with crucial evidence that proved patterns of obstruction and cover-up spanning 15 years. Her dedication to investigating cases that other officers had been pressured to abandon provided the foundation for understanding how deeply the Hamilton influence had penetrated local law enforcement. The federal recognition of her work led to her appointment as head of a new task force focused on identifying and dismantling similar corruption networks throughout Oregon and Washington. The Hamilton Development Company's properties became the subject of extensive federal seizure proceedings, as investigators worked to trace the source of funds used in their acquisition and development. Many of the company's most prestigious projects had been purchased with money laundered through the network Tyler had exposed, making the properties subject to civil forfeiture under federal anti-racketeering statutes. The luxury developments that had symbolized the Hamilton family's legitimate business success were revealed to be monuments to decades of criminal enterprise. Willowbrook Estate, the venue where Tyler and I should have been married, was among the properties seized by federal authorities. The irony wasn't lost on me that our canceled wedding had taken place at a location purchased with the proceeds of the criminal activities Tyler had died trying to expose. The estate's seizure felt like poetic justice, transforming a symbol of Hamilton power into evidence of their downfall. Grace Hamilton's recovery became a powerful symbol of hope for other victims of Dr. Reed's conditioning program. As the experimental drugs cleared from her system, her memories of discovering the Foundation's fraudulent activities gradually returned, providing federal investigators with additional evidence of the systematic corruption she'd tried to expose 5 years earlier. Her testimony about the conditioning process she'd endured helped prosecutors understand the sophisticated psychological torture Dr. Reed had developed for eliminating threats to his clients' criminal enterprises. The reunion between Tyler and Grace was emotionally overwhelming for both siblings, as they struggled to reconcile their memories of Dr. Reed's manipulation with their genuine affection for each other. Grace's forced loyalty to Victoria had created years of tension between the siblings, but her recovery revealed that Tyler's concerns about family dynamics had been valid rather than paranoid. The conditioning program had been designed to isolate Tyler from potential allies within his own family, making him more vulnerable to manipulation and less likely to find support for his investigations. Tyler's journal entries from the weeks before his disappearance took on new significance, as federal investigators used them to understand the psychological pressure he'd been under while gathering evidence against his family. His documentation of increasing anxiety, sleep disruption, and difficulty concentrating weren't symptoms of pre-wedding stress. They were evidence of systematic poisoning designed to make him appear mentally unstable. Dr. Reed had been gradually increasing Tyler's medication dosages, while reporting to Victoria that her son was showing signs of psychological breakdown that would soon require intensive intervention. The wedding gifts that had been delivered to our apartment in the days before Tyler's disappearance were revealed to contain sophisticated surveillance equipment, allowing Victoria and Dr. Reed to monitor Tyler's activities and communications in real time. The expensive presents from family friends had been equipped with listening devices and cameras that transmitted data to a monitoring station Dr. Reed maintained at his mountain facility. Tyler's growing paranoia about being watched had been entirely justified, though he'd never suspected that the surveillance was being conducted through seemingly innocent wedding presents. Caroline Stevens, our wedding planner, had been an unwitting accomplice in the Hamilton family's scheme to isolate Tyler from potential allies. Victoria had specifically requested that Caroline limit the guest list to people who were either Hamilton business associates or individuals with financial ties to the family's various enterprises. The absence of Tyler's college friends, my law firm colleagues, and other independent observers from our wedding had been designed to ensure that no one would question Tyler's disappearance or investigate his supposed suicide too thoroughly. The suicide note that had convinced me something was wrong with Tyler's disappearance became a key piece of evidence in Dr. Reed's prosecution. Handwriting analysis revealed that the note had been created by tracing Tyler's actual handwriting while he was heavily sedated, a technique Dr. Reed had perfected for creating authentic-looking documents that couldn't be easily identified as forgeries. The therapist had forced Tyler to practice writing various phrases while under the influence of drugs that enhanced compliance, creating a library of handwriting samples that could be combined into convincing fake communications. Victoria Hamilton's trial revealed the full extent of her control over Tyler's life and her systematic elimination of anyone who threatened her criminal empire. Testimony from former Hamilton employees described a pattern of manipulation and intimidation that had been refined over decades, with Dr. Reed's conditioning program representing the latest evolution of her methods for dealing with inconvenient opposition. Victoria's maternal facade had disguised a ruthless criminal mastermind who viewed her own children as assets to be managed rather than people to be loved. The federal investigation expanded beyond the Hamilton family, as investigators discovered connections to similar operations in other states. Dr. Reed's conditioning techniques had been shared with criminal organizations throughout the West Coast, creating a network of private psychiatric facilities that served as detention centers for people who posed threats to various illegal enterprises. The systematic nature of these operations revealed a level of criminal sophistication that federal authorities had never previously encountered in domestic organized crime. Tyler's evidence package had included financial records showing payments from the Hamilton organization to similar operations in California, Nevada, and Washington, suggesting that the family had been part of a larger criminal network rather than an isolated local operation. These connections led to additional federal investigations and arrests, multiplying the impact of Tyler's courage in gathering evidence, despite the personal risks involved. The Hamilton Foundation's charitable activities were revealed to be an elaborate money laundering scheme that had diverted millions of dollars intended for homeless shelters, drug treatment programs, and educational initiatives. Grace's original discovery of these financial irregularities had been more significant than anyone realized, uncovering evidence of systematic fraud that extended across multiple states and involved dozens of legitimate charitable organizations that had unknowingly participated in the laundering network. The foundation's board of directors included prominent community leaders who had been genuinely unaware of the criminal activities being conducted through their organization. Their shock and horror at learning how their charitable work had been manipulated provided some of the most compelling testimony in Victoria's trial, demonstrating how sophisticated criminal operations could exploit the goodwill of legitimate institutions to further their illegal objectives. Dr. Reed's psychological conditioning program was revealed to be based on research conducted by intelligence agencies during the Cold War, adapted and refined for civilian criminal applications. The therapist had obtained access to classified research through contacts in the intelligence community who had been corrupted by Hamilton money, providing him with techniques that had been developed for interrogation and control of foreign agents. The revelation that domestic criminals had access to government psychological warfare methods raised serious questions about oversight of former intelligence personnel and classified research. The mountain facility where Tyler had been held contained extensive research laboratories where Dr. Reed had been experimenting with new pharmaceutical compounds designed to enhance psychological conditioning. Federal investigators discovered that the therapist had been conducting unauthorized human experiments on his patients, testing drug combinations that could accelerate memory modification and personality restructuring. The facility had essentially been operating as a private research center for developing more effective methods of psychological control. Tyler's testimony about his experience in Dr. Reed's facility provided federal prosecutors with detailed first-hand accounts of the conditioning process, helping them understand the systematic nature of the psychological torture that had been disguised as medical treatment. His description of the medication regimens, isolation techniques, and psychological manipulation methods used gave investigators insight into how Dr. Reed had been able to transform so many victims into compliant individuals with altered memories and loyalties. The recordings I had made during my visit to Dr. Reed's facility became crucial evidence in demonstrating the casual nature of the crimes being committed. Dr. Reed's comfortable discussion of his treatment methods, his clinical descriptions of psychological manipulation techniques, and his confident assumption that his operations were protected by local corruption provided prosecutors with compelling evidence of systematic criminal enterprise conducted with complete disregard for human rights. The facility's patient records revealed that many of the people Dr. Reed had treated over the years had been held far longer than medically necessary, with their releases timed to coincide with the resolution of whatever criminal investigations or legal proceedings had made their original concerns inconvenient. The systematic nature of these timing coincidences demonstrated that the facility had been operating as a detention center rather than a medical treatment facility. Grace Hamilton's detailed testimony about her 5 years of unnecessary treatment provided prosecutors with evidence of the long-term effects of Dr. Reed's conditioning program. Her description of gradually losing her memories of the Foundation's financial irregularities, her forced development of loyalty to Victoria despite her original concerns, and her slow recovery of her authentic personality after federal intervention demonstrated the sophisticated nature of the psychological manipulation she had endured. The reunion between Tyler and me required careful management by federal medical experts who understood the potential complications of his recovery from psychological conditioning. The drugs Dr. Reed had administered could have lasting effects on memory formation and emotional regulation, meaning that Tyler's feelings about our relationship might have been altered during his captivity. Federal psychologists worked with both of us to help Tyler distinguish between his authentic emotions and any artificial loyalties or fears that might have been installed during his treatment. Tyler's memories of gathering evidence against his family gradually returned as the effects of Dr. Reed's medications diminished, but his recollections of our relationship and his feelings about our planned marriage required more time to fully restore. The man who emerged from federal medical treatment was recognizably the person I had fallen in love with, but he had been profoundly changed by his experience of betrayal by his own family and his understanding of the criminal enterprise he had risked everything to expose. The wedding dress that had hung in our apartment during Tyler's disappearance became a symbol of hope during his recovery, representing the future we had planned together and our determination to reclaim it despite the trauma we had both endured. Tyler's first clear memory after his rescue was of seeing me in that dress during our final fitting, a recollection that helped anchor his recovering sense of identity and his commitment to rebuilding our relationship. The Hamilton family's downfall sent shockwaves through Riverside's social and business communities, as the extent of their corruption became public knowledge. Many of the city's most prominent citizens found themselves having to account for their relationships with the Hamilton organization, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and recrimination that would take years to resolve. The revelation that one of the community's most respected families had been operating a sophisticated criminal enterprise forced a reckoning with how such activities had been able to continue undetected for so long. The seizure of Hamilton properties and assets provided federal authorities with resources to compensate some of the victims of their criminal activities, though the psychological damage inflicted by Dr. Reed's conditioning program could never be fully repaired. Many of the people who had been subjected to his treatment faced years of recovery work to restore their authentic personalities and recover memories that had been systematically suppressed. Tyler's decision to cooperate fully with federal investigators, despite the personal cost of testifying against his own family, provided prosecutors with insider knowledge that was crucial for understanding the full scope of the criminal enterprise. His detailed knowledge of the family's business operations, combined with the evidence he had gathered before his disappearance, gave federal authorities the information they needed to dismantle not just the Hamilton organization, but the broader criminal network it had been part of. The federal trials that resulted from Tyler's evidence lasted for more than 2 years, as prosecutors worked to present the complex financial and psychological crimes that had been committed. Victoria Hamilton received a sentence of 35 years in federal prison, while Dr. Reed was sentenced to life imprisonment for his role in systematically torturing dozens of victims through his conditioning program. The severity of their sentences reflected the sophisticated nature of their crimes and the extensive harm they had inflicted on their victims and the broader community. The establishment of a victim support foundation using assets seized from the Hamilton organization provided resources for other people who had been subjected to similar psychological manipulation by criminal enterprises. Tyler and I worked together to develop programs that could help victims of conditioning recover their authentic personalities and rebuild their lives after experiencing systematic psychological abuse. Our shared commitment to helping others who had endured similar trauma became a foundation for rebuilding our own relationship and creating meaning from the suffering we had both experienced. The mountain facility where Tyler had been held was converted into a legitimate medical research center focused on developing treatments for victims of psychological conditioning and trauma. The federal government's decision to transform Dr. Reed's torture center into a healing institution provided a powerful symbol of justice and recovery, demonstrating that the locations where crimes had been committed could be reclaimed for positive purposes. Detective Park's new role leading the federal task force on criminal corruption provided her with resources and authority she had never possessed during her years of frustrated local investigations. Her work identifying and dismantling similar criminal networks throughout the Pacific Northwest prevented other families from experiencing the kind of systematic psychological abuse that Tyler, Grace, and I had endured. Her persistence in investigating cases that other law enforcement officials had been pressured to ignore had ultimately led to one of the most significant organized crime prosecutions in the region's history. The revelation that Tyler's supposed suicide had actually been an elaborate kidnapping designed to prevent him from exposing his family's criminal activities changed public understanding of how sophisticated criminal enterprises could manipulate public perception and law enforcement response. The fake suicide note, the careful timing of his disappearance, and the systematic isolation of potential witnesses demonstrated a level of criminal planning that challenged assumptions about how organized crime operated in contemporary America. Our eventual wedding, held 2 years after Tyler's rescue in a simple ceremony at the Victim Support Foundation we had established together, was attended by many of the people whose lives had been saved by Tyler's courage in gathering evidence against his family. Grace served as my maid of honor, her recovery from Dr. Reed's conditioning program, symbolizing the possibility of healing and renewal, even after the most sophisticated psychological abuse. Detective Park performed the ceremony in her capacity as an ordained minister, her role in bringing justice to the Hamilton family making her the natural choice to officiate our union. The Hamilton family's criminal empire had been built on the systematic abuse of trust and the exploitation of legitimate institutions for illegal purposes. Their downfall demonstrated that even the most sophisticated criminal operations could be exposed and dismantled when victims found the courage to come forward, and law enforcement officials were willing to pursue justice despite political pressure and corruption. Tyler's evidence had not only saved his own life and brought justice to his family's victims, but it also created a model for investigating and prosecuting similar criminal enterprises that exploited psychological manipulation and institutional corruption to further their illegal objectives. The morning I walked into Dr. Reed's mountain facility wearing a recording device felt like stepping into the heart of a beast that had been devouring lives for decades. The pristine exterior of the building, with its modern glass architecture and carefully maintained landscaping, masked the horror that lurked within its walls. I had rehearsed my role as the devastated fiancé countless times with Detective Park, but nothing could have prepared me for the reality of facing the man who had orchestrated Tyler's psychological destruction. Dr. Reed emerged from his office with the practiced sympathy of a predator who had perfected the art of appearing trustworthy. His silver hair was immaculately styled, his expensive suit tailored to project authority and competence. The warm smile he offered me had undoubtedly comforted hundreds of family members over the years, all of whom had unknowingly delivered their loved ones into his carefully constructed web of manipulation and control. "Ms. Brooks," he said, extending his hand with apparent genuine concern, "I cannot imagine how difficult this must be for you. Tyler spoke of you constantly during our sessions. He was clearly devoted to you, which makes his current condition all the more heartbreaking." The casual mention of Tyler's devotion was delivered like a scalpel wrapped in silk, designed to inflict maximum emotional pain while maintaining the therapist's facade of professional compassion. Dr. Reed was already beginning the psychological manipulation that he had perfected over years of practice, using my love for Tyler as a weapon against my ability to think clearly about his disappearance. We walked through corridors that had been designed to project tranquility and healing, but I noticed details that revealed the facility's true nature. The artwork hanging on the walls was bolted in place rather than simply mounted. The comfortable seating in the common areas was positioned to be visible from multiple security cameras. Most telling of all, every door we passed required electronic keycard access, including the exits that should have been freely available to patients in a voluntary treatment facility. Tyler's case presents unique challenges, Dr. Reed continued as we toured the facility's public areas. The paranoid delusions he developed about his family's business activities are remarkably detailed and internally consistent. Patients with this type of condition can be extremely convincing when describing their imaginary concerns, which makes treatment particularly complex. The therapist's explanation was a masterpiece of preemptive gaslighting, designed to undermine any credibility Tyler might have if he managed to communicate his actual situation to me. Dr. Reed was systematically preparing me to dismiss anything Tyler might say about the Hamilton family's criminal activities as symptoms of mental illness, rather than legitimate observations backed by documented evidence. His office was a shrine to manufactured authority, filled with diplomas from prestigious universities, awards from professional psychiatric organizations, and photographs of Dr. Reed with various political and business leaders. The wall display was clearly designed to overwhelm visitors with evidence of his expertise and connections, making it psychologically difficult to question his professional judgment about patients under his care. "I understand your desire to see Tyler immediately," Dr. Reed said, settling behind his desk with practiced authority, "but I must explain why that would be counterproductive at this stage of his treatment. Tyler's paranoid ideation centers specifically on perceived threats to your safety. Contact with you during the acute phase of his condition could trigger violent episodes that might result in harm to himself or others." The explanation was clinically delivered and superficially reasonable, but Tyler's journal entries had revealed that Dr. Reed routinely used similar justifications to isolate patients from anyone who might question their treatment or provide emotional support during the conditioning process. The therapist was systematically cutting Tyler off from all external relationships that might interfere with the psychological reconstruction he was conducting. "What exactly triggered this breakdown?" I asked, keeping my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. Tyler seemed perfectly normal until very recently. How could such a severe condition develop so suddenly? Dr. Reed leaned forward with apparent concern, his expression conveying deep sympathy for my confusion and distress. "Wedding-related stress can be a significant trigger for individuals with underlying psychological vulnerabilities," he explained. Tyler had been managing his anxiety and paranoid tendencies quite well through our outpatient sessions, but the pressure of impending marriage activated dormant psychological patterns that required immediate intervention. The casual dismissal of Tyler's legitimate concerns about his family's criminal activities as wedding stress was breathtaking in its audacity. Dr. Reed was literally rewriting reality, transforming Tyler's courageous investigation into evidence of mental illness. The therapist's confidence in his ability to manipulate my perception of events spoke to years of successful deception with other family members who had delivered loved ones into his care. The paranoid delusions Tyler developed are quite elaborate, Dr. Reed continued, pulling what appeared to be a patient file from his desk drawer. He believes his family is involved in money laundering, that I am part of some conspiracy to control his behavior, and that his mother orchestrated his commitment to this facility. These delusions are remarkably detailed and internally consistent, which makes them particularly dangerous because they can seem plausible to people who care about him. Every word Dr. Reed spoke was being captured by the recording device concealed in my jacket pocket, but listening to him casually describe Tyler's accurate observations as delusional thinking was almost unbearable. The therapist was providing a perfect example of how criminal enterprises could use mental health systems to silence inconvenient witnesses and eliminate potential threats to their operations. How long will Tyler need to remain here? I asked, though I already knew from his recorded conversations with Victoria that the answer would be measured in months rather than weeks. Cases involving complex paranoid delusions typically require 6 to 12 months of intensive treatment, Dr. Reed replied without hesitation. Tyler's condition is particularly challenging because his delusions involve family members who are actually very supportive of his recovery. The contradiction between his paranoid beliefs and reality creates cognitive dissonance that must be carefully managed through medication and therapy. The clinical language couldn't disguise what Dr. Reed was actually describing: the systematic destruction of Tyler's personality and memories over a period of months, using pharmaceutical and psychological techniques that would leave him unable to remember or care about the evidence he had gathered against his family. The therapist was casually discussing psychological torture as if it were routine medical treatment. "I've brought some personal items that might provide comfort during his recovery," I said, producing a small bag containing photographs and mementos from our relationship. The items were genuinely meaningful to Tyler and me, but they also served as props to maintain my cover as a concerned fiancé rather than an investigator gathering evidence. Dr. Reed accepted the bag with apparent gratitude, but I watched him examine each item with the suspicious scrutiny of someone who had learned to be paranoid about potential surveillance. The therapist's careful inspection of innocent photographs and keepsakes revealed the heightened state of alert that came from conducting criminal activities while maintaining a professional facade. "We'll review these items with Tyler during his next therapy session," Dr. Reed said, setting the bag aside with deliberate care. "However, I should prepare you for the possibility that he may not recognize the significance of these objects. Patients in his condition sometimes develop negative associations with relationships and experiences from the period when their delusions were most active." The implication was clear that Tyler might not remember our relationship, or might react to reminders of our life together with confusion or hostility. Dr. Reed was preparing me for the possibility that the conditioning process had already begun altering Tyler's memories and emotional attachments, transforming the man I loved into someone who might not recognize me as significant in his life. As our conversation continued, Reed became increasingly comfortable sharing details about Tyler's treatment, apparently confident that I posed no threat to his operation. He described medication protocols designed to enhance what he called therapeutic compliance, psychological techniques intended to help Tyler, quote, recognize the unrealistic nature of his concerns, and family therapy sessions that would eventually help Tyler, quote, rebuild healthy relationships with his loved ones. Each euphemism was more chilling than the last. Clinical language that disguised systematic psychological warfare designed to transform Tyler into a compliant victim with no memory of the evidence that could expose his family's criminal empire. The recording device was capturing every word, building the case that Detective Park needed to convince federal investigators to intervene immediately. "Tyler is currently housed in our residential wing," Dr. Reed mentioned casually while describing the facility's various treatment areas. "The natural mountain setting provides an ideal environment for psychological healing, away from the urban stressors that contributed to his condition. Many patients find the isolation helpful for focusing on their recovery without external distractions." The description of Tyler's location was exactly what Detective Park needed to plan any rescue operation, but Dr. Reed's casual mention of isolation revealed the true purpose of the facility's remote location. Patients were held far from potential witnesses or investigators, making it virtually impossible for anyone to monitor their treatment or question the methods being employed. Our meeting was interrupted by a staff member who needed Dr. Reed's immediate attention regarding what was described as a patient incident in the residential wing. The therapist excused himself with apparent regret, promising to return shortly to continue our discussion. His departure provided me with the opportunity I had been hoping for since arriving at the facility. The corridors Dr. Reed had avoided during our official tour led toward areas of the building that looked more like a detention facility than a medical treatment center. The architecture here was institutional rather than therapeutic, with reinforced doors, small windows, and security cameras positioned to monitor every movement. This was clearly where patients were actually held, far from the comfortable public areas designed to impress visiting family members. Following signs that pointed toward the residential wing, I moved as quickly as possible while trying to appear like a confused visitor rather than someone conducting unauthorized reconnaissance. The recording device continued capturing audio of my observations, documenting the facility's true layout and security measures for Detective Park's use in planning law enforcement response. The residential wing was accessed through a security checkpoint that should have required keycard authorization, but maintenance staff had propped the door open while working in the corridor. I slipped through the opening and found myself in a hallway lined with numbered rooms, each equipped with small observation windows and electronic locks that could only be operated from the outside. Room 247 contained the person I had been searching for since finding his fake suicide note 4 days earlier. Tyler lay on a narrow institutional bed, his eyes open but unfocused, clearly under the influence of heavy sedation. He appeared to have lost weight during his captivity, and his face had the vacant expression I remembered seeing in Grace Hamilton after her supposed recovery from psychiatric treatment years earlier. Tyler's recognition of me was delayed but unmistakable. His eyes struggled to focus, and I saw a flicker of the man I had fallen in love with, fighting against whatever medications they had administered to keep him compliant. He tried to speak, but his words were slurred and difficult to understand, evidence of the pharmaceutical cocktail Dr. Reed was using to facilitate the conditioning process. "Natalie," Tyler managed to whisper, his voice barely audible above the hum of ventilation systems. Evidence still hidden, need to stop them before they complete. His fragmented words trailed off as footsteps echoed in the corridor outside his room. Dr. Reed had apparently discovered my unauthorized exploration of the facility, and his voice carried none of the professional warmth he had projected during our official meeting. Security personnel were being summoned, and I realized that my infiltration had been detected. The sound of approaching footsteps sent adrenaline coursing through my system as I realized the precarious nature of my situation. I was alone in a remote facility controlled by people who had perfected the art of making inconvenient problems disappear, and my presence in an unauthorized area could not be explained as the confused wandering of a distraught family member. "Ms. Brooks!" Dr. Reed's voice carried a sharp edge that hadn't been present during our earlier conversation. "I'm afraid you've wandered into a restricted area. For the safety of our patients and the security of our facility, family members are not permitted in the residential wing without escort." The therapist appeared at the end of the corridor, flanked by 2 security guards, his professional mask slipping to reveal the calculated predator beneath. His eyes held none of the sympathetic warmth he had projected earlier, replaced by the cold assessment of someone evaluating a potential threat to his operation. "I was looking for a restroom," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. "The facility is larger than I realized, and I seem to have gotten lost." Dr. Reed's expression suggested he wasn't convinced by my explanation, but he couldn't definitively prove that I had been deliberately investigating the facility rather than simply wandering confused through unfamiliar corridors. The ambiguity of the situation provided enough plausible deniability to prevent him from taking more aggressive action against me. "Of course," he said, his tone regaining some of its earlier professional warmth. "The facility can be confusing for first-time visitors. Please allow me to escort you back to the main building. I'm afraid our tour will need to conclude, as I have other appointments this afternoon." The dismissal was polite but firm, and the presence of security guards made it clear that my visit was over regardless of my preferences. Dr. Reed was moving to contain any damage my unauthorized exploration might have caused, while maintaining the facade of professional courtesy that protected his operation from suspicion. As we walked back toward the main building, Dr. Reed made casual conversation about Tyler's treatment plan and my role in his eventual recovery. But his eyes continued to assess me with suspicious calculation, and I sensed that my behavior during the visit had raised concerns about my potential threat to the facility's operations. Tyler is fortunate to have someone who cares so deeply about his well-being, Dr. Reed said as we reached the main lobby. However, I must emphasize that contact with family members during the acute phase of treatment can be counterproductive. I would recommend waiting at least 6 weeks before visiting again, to allow Tyler's condition to stabilize. The recommendation was actually a warning that I would not be welcome at the facility for the foreseeable future. Dr. Reed was buying time to complete whatever conditioning process he had begun on Tyler, while preventing me from monitoring his progress or gathering additional evidence about the treatment being provided. The drive down the mountain road felt like an escape from enemy territory, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel and processed what I had witnessed. Tyler was alive but in immediate danger, held in a facility designed to systematically destroy his personality and memories. The recording device had captured everything I needed to convince federal authorities to intervene, but I was terrified that Dr. Reed's suspicions about my visit might prompt him to accelerate Tyler's treatment. Detective Park was waiting at our predetermined meeting location, her expression grim as she prepared to review whatever evidence I had managed to gather during my infiltration of the facility. The next few hours would determine whether Tyler could be rescued before Dr. Reed's conditioning process transformed him into another success story for the Hamilton family's elimination of inconvenient witnesses. The audio recordings I had captured provided federal investigators with unprecedented insight into how sophisticated criminal enterprises could exploit mental health systems to silence potential witnesses and eliminate threats to their operations. Dr. Reed's casual descriptions of Tyler's treatment, his clinical explanations of medication protocols, and his confident assumptions about the protection his facility enjoyed from law enforcement scrutiny had all been documented with federal quality recording equipment. "This is better than we dared hope," Detective Park said after reviewing the audio files. Dr. Reed essentially confessed to systematic human rights violations while believing he was speaking to a harmless family member. Federal prosecutors will have everything they need to obtain emergency warrants and move against the facility immediately. The recordings also provided tactical intelligence that would be crucial for any rescue operation. My observations of the facility's layout, security measures, and Tyler's specific location would allow federal agents to plan a coordinated assault that could secure evidence while ensuring the safety of patients who were being held against their will. But the clock was ticking inexorably toward a point of no return for Tyler's recovery. Dr. Reed's conditioning process was designed to be irreversible after a certain threshold, and my unauthorized visit to the residential wing had almost certainly prompted the therapist to accelerate his timeline for completing Tyler's psychological transformation. The federal agents who would storm the mountain facility at dawn were already being briefed on the intelligence I had gathered, preparing for an operation that could expose one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises ever discovered in the Pacific Northwest. But their success would depend on reaching Tyler before Dr. Reed could complete the process of erasing everything that made him the man I had fallen in love with. As I prepared for what might be the longest night of my life, I thought about Tyler's desperate whisper that the evidence was still hidden and that something needed to be stopped before completion. His fragmented words suggested that he retained some awareness of his situation despite the medication, giving me hope that the conditioning process hadn't progressed beyond the point of recovery. The wedding dress hanging in our apartment had become a symbol of everything I was fighting to reclaim, representing not just our planned future together, but Tyler's fundamental right to exist as himself rather than as a manufactured version designed to serve his family's criminal interests. Tomorrow would determine whether that future remained possible or whether Dr. Reed's psychological warfare had already claimed another victim. The federal assault on Dr. Reed's mountain facility began at 5:30 in the morning, coordinated with military precision to prevent the destruction of evidence and ensure the safety of patients held against their will. I watched from a command vehicle parked 2 miles down the mountain road as FBI agents, DEA operatives, and federal marshals surrounded the building that had become Tyler's prison. The sight of federal vehicles racing up the winding mountain road represented hope materializing after days of desperate uncertainty. Detective Park stood beside me, her radio crackling with tactical communications as agents reported their positions around the facility's perimeter. The intelligence I had gathered during my infiltration had allowed federal planners to identify security vulnerabilities and locate the residential wing where Tyler was being held. Everything depended on reaching him before Dr. Reed could administer additional medications that might cause permanent neurological damage. The operation unfolded with breathtaking efficiency, agents breaching multiple entry points simultaneously to prevent anyone inside from coordinating resistance or destroying evidence. Through binoculars, I watched federal personnel streaming into the building while others secured the parking areas and maintenance facilities where additional evidence might be stored. The facility that had projected such an aura of untouchable authority just hours earlier was being systematically dismantled by federal law enforcement. Dr. Reed was arrested in his office while attempting to incinerate patient files that documented the systematic psychological torture he had been conducting for over a decade. The therapist's calm professional demeanor evaporated completely when confronted by federal agents who had recorded evidence of his crimes, replaced by desperate attempts to justify his actions as legitimate medical treatment. His protests that patients had consented to their confinement rang hollow in the face of documentation showing systematic deception and coercion. Tyler's rescue from room 247 required immediate medical intervention to counteract the effects of experimental drugs that Dr. Reed had been administering without informed consent. Federal paramedics worked to stabilize his condition while emergency physicians evaluated the extent of neurological damage caused by the pharmaceutical cocktail designed to enhance psychological conditioning. The man I had found lying catatonic on an institutional bed was slowly emerging from a chemical fog that had been deliberately imposed to facilitate his psychological reconstruction. The medical team's initial assessment provided cautious optimism about Tyler's prospects for full recovery. The drugs Dr. Reed had used were designed to enhance compliance and suppress critical thinking rather than cause permanent brain damage, meaning that Tyler's memories and personality could potentially be restored with appropriate treatment. But the conditioning process had progressed far enough to create gaps in his recollection of recent events, including some aspects of his investigation into his family's criminal activities. Grace Hamilton was discovered in room 156, 5 years after her supposed recovery from the bipolar disorder that had never actually existed. Her rescue was even more dramatic than Tyler's, as she had been subjected to Dr. Reed's conditioning protocols for an extended period that had fundamentally altered her personality and memories. The vibrant, independent woman Tyler remembered from their childhood was buried beneath layers of artificial compliance and manufactured loyalty to Victoria. But federal medical experts believed she could recover with intensive deprogramming therapy. The facility's patient records revealed the scope of Dr. Reed's operations, documenting dozens of cases where people had been held for months or years under false pretenses. Each file told a story of systematic psychological destruction disguised as medical treatment, with patients admitted for questioning inconvenient business practices and released as compliant individuals with no memory of their previous concerns. The clinical documentation of these crimes provided federal prosecutors with evidence of systematic human rights violations that could not be dismissed or explained away. Victoria Hamilton's arrest at her Riverside mansion occurred simultaneously with the mountain facility raid, preventing her from destroying financial records that Tyler had identified as crucial evidence of the money laundering operation. FBI agents found her in her study with a paper shredder, surrounded by boxes of documents that detailed decades of criminal activity conducted through the Hamilton Development Company and associated organizations. Her attempts to destroy evidence were futile, as Tyler's hidden caches had already provided federal investigators with copies of the most damaging materials. The coordination of the federal operation impressed even experienced law enforcement professionals, as agents moved simultaneously against every component of the Hamilton criminal enterprise to prevent the systematic destruction of evidence that had protected the family for decades. Bank records were seized from multiple financial institutions, construction sites were secured to preserve evidence of money laundering activities, and political figures who had received Hamilton contributions found themselves facing uncomfortable questions about their relationships with the family. Dr. Reed's confession came within hours of his arrest, as federal agents confronted him with recordings of his conversations with me during my visit to the facility. The therapist's clinical descriptions of patient treatment protocols, his casual discussions of psychological conditioning techniques, and his confident assumptions about legal protection for his activities had all been captured with federal quality recording equipment. Faced with irrefutable evidence of his crimes, Dr. Reed attempted to negotiate immunity in exchange for information about the broader criminal network he had been serving. The scope of the criminal conspiracy that emerged from Dr. Reed's debriefing shocked federal investigators who had initially focused on the Hamilton family's money laundering activities. The therapist had been operating conditioning facilities in 3 states, serving multiple criminal organizations that needed inconvenient people eliminated without creating bodies that might trigger investigations. His patient files contained evidence of systematic torture disguised as medical treatment, conducted with the knowledge and approval of corrupt officials who had been purchased with criminal proceeds. Tyler's recovery from Dr. Reed's conditioning required weeks of specialized medical treatment, but federal experts were optimistic about his long-term prognosis. The experimental drugs that had been administered during his captivity were gradually metabolized from his system, allowing his natural personality and memories to reassert themselves. The man who had risked everything to expose his family's crimes was slowly returning, though the trauma of betrayal by his own mother would require years of genuine therapy to fully process. The federal trials that followed revealed the extraordinary scope of corruption that had protected the Hamilton family's operations for decades. City council members who had received consulting contracts, police officials who had accepted donations to departmental programs, and judges who had benefited from campaign contributions, all found themselves facing federal corruption charges. The systematic nature of the bribery network demonstrated how criminal enterprises could capture entire communities through seemingly legitimate financial relationships. Victoria Hamilton's trial became a media sensation as prosecutors presented evidence of her role in orchestrating one of the most sophisticated criminal operations ever discovered in the Pacific Northwest. Her transformation from respected philanthropist to exposed criminal mastermind captivated public attention, while her systematic manipulation of her own children provided compelling evidence of the depths to which she had sunk in pursuit of criminal profit. The woman who had projected such maternal concern during Tyler's disappearance was revealed as someone who viewed her offspring as assets to be managed rather than people to be loved. The Hamilton Development Company's properties became subjects of extensive federal seizure proceedings as investigators worked to trace the sources of funds used in their acquisition and development. Many of the company's most prestigious projects had been purchased with laundered money, making them subject to civil forfeiture under federal anti-racketeering statutes. The luxury developments that had symbolized the Hamilton family's legitimate success were transformed into monuments to their criminal enterprise. Grace Hamilton's recovery became a powerful symbol of hope for other victims of Dr. Reed's conditioning program. As the experimental drugs cleared from her system, her memories of discovering the Foundation's fraudulent activities gradually returned, providing federal investigators with additional evidence of the systematic corruption she had tried to expose years earlier. Her testimony about the conditioning process she had endured helped prosecutors understand the sophisticated psychological torture Dr. Reed had developed for his criminal clients. The reunion between Tyler and Grace was emotionally overwhelming for both siblings, as they struggled to reconcile their memories of family loyalty with their emerging understanding of Victoria's systematic manipulation. The conditioning program had been designed to isolate them from each other, making each more vulnerable to maternal control and less likely to find support for questioning family activities. Their recovery required rebuilding a relationship that had been deliberately damaged by psychological warfare. Tyler's journal entries from the weeks before his disappearance took on new significance as federal investigators used them to understand the psychological pressure he had been under while gathering evidence against his family. His documentation of increasing anxiety, sleep disruption, and difficulty concentrating weren't symptoms of pre-wedding stress, but evidence of systematic poisoning designed to make him appear mentally unstable. Dr. Reed had been gradually increasing Tyler's medication dosages while reporting to Victoria that her son was showing signs of breakdown requiring intervention. The wedding gifts that had been delivered to our apartment contained sophisticated surveillance equipment that had allowed Victoria and Dr. Reed to monitor Tyler's activities in real time. The expensive presents from family friends had been equipped with listening devices and cameras that transmitted data to monitoring stations Dr. Reed maintained for tracking his targets. Tyler's growing paranoia about being watched had been entirely justified, though he had never suspected that surveillance was being conducted through seemingly innocent wedding presents. Our eventual wedding, held 18 months after Tyler's rescue, was a celebration of survival and renewal, rather than the social event we had originally planned. The ceremony took place in the garden of the Victim Support Foundation we had established, using assets seized from the Hamilton organization, surrounded by people whose lives had been saved by Tyler's courage in gathering evidence against his family. Detective Park officiated the ceremony in her capacity as an ordained minister, her role in bringing justice to the Hamilton Empire, making her the natural choice to unite us in marriage. Grace served as my maid of honor, her recovery from Dr. Reed's conditioning program symbolizing the possibility of healing, even after sophisticated psychological abuse. The woman who had been transformed into a compliant automaton through years of medical torture had reclaimed her authentic personality and become a powerful advocate for other victims of similar crimes. Her presence at our wedding represented triumph over the forces that had tried to destroy our family through manipulation and control. The guest list for our actual wedding included federal agents who had participated in the rescue operation, medical professionals who had aided in Tyler's recovery, and other victims of the Hamilton organization who had found the courage to come forward after the initial arrests. The celebration was smaller than our originally planned event, but infinitely more meaningful, bringing together people who understood the true significance of our survival and renewal. Tyler's recovery had progressed to the point where he could remember most of his investigation into his family's criminal activities, though some details of the conditioning process remained hazy. His determination to help other victims of similar psychological manipulation had become a driving force in his healing, providing purpose and meaning to the trauma he had endured. The man who had risked everything to expose corruption had emerged from captivity with an even stronger commitment to justice and accountability. The Victim Support Foundation we established became a model for assisting people who had been subjected to psychological conditioning by criminal organizations. Our shared experience of surviving systematic manipulation and betrayal provided us with unique insights into the recovery process, while the resources provided through asset forfeiture gave us the means to offer comprehensive support services. The Foundation's work expanded beyond individual victims to include research into conditioning techniques and advocacy for stronger legal protections against psychological torture. The Hamilton family's downfall sent ripples through criminal networks across the West Coast, as federal investigations expanded to include other organizations that had used similar tactics for eliminating inconvenient witnesses. Dr. Reed's cooperation with federal authorities led to raids on conditioning facilities in California, Nevada, and Washington, resulting in the rescue of dozens of additional victims and the exposure of criminal enterprises that had operated with impunity for years. Detective Park's appointment to head a federal task force focused on criminal corruption provided her with resources and authority she had never possessed during her frustrated years of local investigation. Her work identifying and dismantling similar networks throughout the region prevented other families from experiencing the systematic abuse that Tyler, Grace, and I had survived. Her persistence in pursuing cases that other officers had been pressured to ignore had ultimately led to one of the most significant organized crime prosecutions in the region's history. The transformation of Dr. Reed's Mountain facility into a legitimate treatment center for victims of psychological conditioning provided a powerful symbol of justice and redemption. The federal government's decision to convert the torture center into a healing institution demonstrated that locations where crimes had been committed could be reclaimed for positive purposes. The facility that had been used to destroy minds was rebuilt to help restore them, staffed by ethical medical professionals committed to genuine healing rather than criminal manipulation. Tyler's testimony during the federal trials provided prosecutors with insider knowledge that was crucial for understanding the full scope of the criminal enterprise he had risked everything to expose. His detailed descriptions of family business operations, combined with the evidence he had gathered before his disappearance, gave federal authorities the information needed to dismantle not just the Hamilton organization, but the broader network it had been part of. His courage in cooperating fully with investigators, despite the personal cost of testifying against his own family, ensured that justice could be achieved for all victims of their crimes. The sentences handed down in the federal trials reflected the severity and sophistication of the crimes that had been committed. Victoria Hamilton received 35 years in federal prison, while Dr. Reed was sentenced to life imprisonment for his role in systematically torturing dozens of victims through his conditioning program. The lengthy sentences sent a clear message that psychological manipulation and torture would be prosecuted with the full force of federal law, regardless of the wealth or political connections of the perpetrators. The wedding dress that had hung in our apartment during Tyler's disappearance became a cherished symbol of our survival and determination to reclaim the future that Victoria and Dr. Reed had tried to steal. The simple ceremony where I finally wore that dress was infinitely more meaningful than the elaborate celebration we had originally planned, representing genuine love and commitment rather than the social performance the Hamilton family had intended to orchestrate. Years later, as Tyler and I worked together to expand the Victim Support Foundation's reach and impact, we often reflected on how the worst day of our lives had ultimately led to our most meaningful work. The criminal conspiracy that had nearly destroyed us had also provided us with the knowledge and resources to help countless other victims find healing and justice. Our marriage had been forged in the crucible of systematic manipulation and betrayal, emerging stronger and more authentic than it ever could have been without those trials. The Hamilton family's legacy was ultimately transformed from one of criminal exploitation to one of victim advocacy and justice. The resources they had accumulated through decades of illegal activity were redirected toward healing the harm they had caused and preventing similar crimes from being committed against other families. Their downfall had created opportunities for genuine service and redemption that would have been impossible if their crimes had remained hidden. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.